One Piece is a very special case among anime and manga, seeing as it's a serialized story that's been running non-stop for over 25 years. In current year, we're patiently awaiting an anime remake of One Piece's first saga, while the relatively recent live-action adaptation tread that same territory. But this isn't the first time that the series has gone back and updated its older works. In fact, that distinction lies on the shoulders of the 8th film of the series. One Piece, Episode of Alabasta, The Pirates and the Princess of the Desert, also known as One Piece, The Desert Princess and the Pirates Adventures in Alabasta, is actually the earliest One Piece movie that you can watch in English dub format, as well as the earliest One Piece movie available on Netflix in the United States. This is beneficial to me because I'm a dumb American who can only speak Japanese at a very basic level. I know what a tanuki is and how to ask for directions to the train station, but not how to follow them. Episode of Alabasta also takes the distinction of being One Piece's first recap movie. Recap episodes up to that point had been fair game for the series, with several having aired as regular episodes during the Annie's Lobby arc, and 2 having aired as separate broadcasts from the actual show by the time the movie came out. But those all largely consisted of existing animation that hadn't been touched up beyond simply fitting the frame to HD standards. Episode of Alabasta, on the other hand, was completely reanimated, and also had several deviances from the arc as it was released in the anime and manga to fit the whole thing into a 90-minute runtime. As the first attempt at retelling an older arc, Episode of Alabasta also had a very difficult task on its hands. What needs to be changed? What needs to stay the same? How has the style shifted in the almost 5 years since Alabasta was first animated? But most importantly, will looking back at One Piece's past help shape the future of the series? In my other One Piece movie segments, I've given recaps before moving on to the analysis portions of the video, but that's primarily been due to the lack of ease of access that every prior movie has had. If you want to watch One Piece the movie, or Chopper's Kingdom on the Island of Strange Animals, you have to go to less than legitimate sites or pay exorbitant fees to not only get a copy of the film, but also a region-compatible DVD or Blu-ray player. With Episode of Alabasta, that just isn't the case. Also, it's literally just the Alabasta arc. If you're watching this and you haven't seen up to that point in the series, just go watch it or read it and then come back. That said, there is still one addition I want to talk about before sticking my thumb in the pie. One Piece Episode of Alabasta Prologue. The Episode of Alabasta Prologue was added onto the movie much later, being produced for the TV broadcast of Episode of Alabasta in 2011. For reference, Episode of Alabasta came out in 2007. It's 15 minutes long and never released in America, and in fact, I don't even think fan subtitles exist for it. To find it, I had a deep dive into the website that Happiness Forgot, Reddit. Special thank you to Reddit user generic_rocker, your post saved me a lot of hassle. Just like the actual movie, Episode of Alabasta Prologue is a condensed retelling of an older arc, in this case Whiskey Peak. To keep the flow of the arc in line with the movie, there are a few notable differences. To start, Miss Wednesday and Mr. Nine aren't aboard the Going Merry on the approach to Cactus Island. Instead, they're waiting on the shore with the rest of Baroque works as the Straw Hats make landfall. Mr. Nine also plays an even more minimal role than he did in the actual arc, only appearing for crowd shots and a very brief spot of action. The majority of the special is focused on Zoro tearing through Whiskey Peak citizens, which they speed through the opening to get to quicker, and the freshly revealed Princess Vivi being chased by Mr. Five and Miss Valentine's Day, who arrived much sooner than they do in the actual series. Otherwise, barring a few more small changes to the flow of action, this is pretty much just Whiskey Peak. And it's not like even essential viewing for the actual Episode of Alabasta movie, seeing as, again, this was animated as a companion to the movie multiple years later, and as a retelling of an even older arc. In spite of its inessential nature, the prologue has the same foundational basis as the movie, embracing old material to make up for newer projects performing poorly. Your first instinct when you hear that is probably going to be something like, the anime and manga weren't doing poorly in either 2007 or 2011. In fact, those were some of the most peak moments of the series. And yeah, you'd be right, Gaia preemptively made up to make a point, but outside of the main series, One Piece was floundering. One Piece movies started being released in the year 2000, with One Piece the movie. Then in 2001, the second movie came out, and then the third in 2002, and that consistently continued every year right up until 2007, and even a couple years past it. But you know what wasn't consistent in that 8-year time span? How well those movies were doing. Every successive release, starting with Dead End Adventure, the first One Piece movie to be released with independent box office data, grossed less and less than the last. It got to the point where the movie preceding Episode of Alabasta grossed less than half of what Dead End Adventure did, and I can only imagine that projections were looking similar for any original movie that Toei might be able to cook up. Hence, Episode of Alabasta. If selling something new isn't working, why not sell something old and beloved repackaged with fancy new animation and a fresh coat of paint? And then after that doesn't do well, add a little more on top for the TV broadcast. This time it'll work. So yeah, needless to say, Episode of Alabasta did not do well at the box office, getting close to, but ultimately falling short of even Katakuri Castle's $7.2 million gross. The reason why is really simple too. It just wasn't accessible to new audiences. audiences. There's a reason that you start at chapter 1 when you open a book and not chapter 12, or in this case there's a reason they went back and tacked Whiskey Peak to the start of the movie. What makes the Alabasta arc work is that we're seeing the culmination of plot threads that were seeded from the moment that the Straw Hats entered the Grand Line and met Miss Wednesday inside of the giant whale Laboon. We're given dozens of episodes to grow attached to Vivi as the Straw Hats bond with her. We're shown how caring she is when she's willing to push the crew to find a doctor for Nami at the risk of not getting to Alabasta in time. The foes that pursue her are entangled with the Straw Hats on Little Garden, and Karu is also there. Vivi is the emotional core of the arc. If you don't let the audience get to know her, the story won't be nearly as effective. And despite the alterations made in episode of Alabasta, ranging from removing major elements like Ace's existence in the presence of the Marines, to swapping minor elements like having Crocodile dehydrate Luffy's leg rather than his arm, that Vivi-centric emotional core stays fully intact. Because without it, you wouldn't have Alabasta anymore. Just a bunch of weirdos beating each other up in the desert. Thus, the problem appears. Centering the story around Vivi won't be a hit for anyone that hasn't already seen Alabasta, alienating newcomers to the series and placing the success of the franchise on people who've been dedicated fans for years. My name isn't John Toei, so I can never be certain the exact philosophy behind choosing Alabasta of all arcs to adapt, but I have to assume that they were banking on that core audience to come out for the movie under the assumption that the major deviations from canon in the previous movies are what drove that portion of the audience away. Inadvertently, they may have proven the opposite, that One Piece's core audience were the only ones that would show up for these movies, whether they catered to existing fans or not, especially given the aforementioned box office similarities between Katakuri Castle and episode of Alabasta, the former being widely accessible to casual audiences at the cost of quality and focus, and the latter being so narrowly focused on the existing audience that it leaves new members behind on the wayside, and I'm sure neither audience group was pleased by the staggering amount and choices of what was cut. I mentioned before that Ace and the Marines were completely cut from the film. Ace being cut doesn't really impact much, especially since the majority of his time spent in Alabasta was anime-only material of him wandering through the desert, and really just set up a plot thread that wouldn't get picked up for years. Similarly, a lot of smaller moments kind of get folded into one another. All the dance powder info dumping happens shortly after meeting Bon Clay for the first time, the Supersonic Duck Squad is almost completely absent in favor of the perverted crab, Todo just hands Luffy the Yuba water instead of him working for it, but on the other hand, the Marines had a major presence in the arc. Not only was it the first return of Smoker after Logtown, but it also saw him and the Straw Hats briefly and reluctantly working together when Crocodile reveals himself at rain dinners. With no Marines, that means no rain dinners, which is good because it saves time and is largely in service of the series-wide plot that the movie doesn't need to worry about. But cutting rain dinners means we also cut seeing the Baroque Works officer agents meet with Crocodile for the first time, and if that's being cut for time, we may as well also cut Spider's Cafe. Cutting the Marine presence ultimately means that the first time we see the Baroque Works officers is in a random patch of desert where none of their personalities are put on display, effectively making all of them, except for Bon Clay, interchangeable, bland lumps of evil. To top it all off, Toei didn't cut the massive ship that fell down on the port town, because that's the inciting incident for the rebel attack. But since the supporting villains have been trimmed down role-wise, we kind of just cut to an unexplained burning massive city, and the child that once served an important symbolic role is now just a visual shorthand for Baroque Works' cruelty. This also becomes a bit of an issue during the fight scenes. Every fight but Luffy versus Crocodile is incredibly rushed, which isn't helped by the villains being really flat. On top of that, the cuts for time are largely character building moments for the Straw Hats. If there's no 5-ton hammer scene, this shit ain't Alabasta. While Sanji, Chopper, and Usopp aren't supremely negatively effective, Nami versus Miss Doublefinger is one of her most important action moments, and it gets entirely sidelined. The fight is supposed to introduce the Climate Act, her go-to weapon for the rest of the series, and is her first big solo win against a strong opponent. What do we get instead? Her lack of familiarity with Climate Act is barely acknowledged, she has the shortest fight of all the Straw Hats, and whatever growth she would have displayed during her fight happened before the movie even started. Zoro barely fares any better, with his whole thing about learning to cut steel being entirely omitted. That was one of my favorite parts of the whole saga, demonstrating his ability to cut nothing by slashing at the leaves, standing in the one clear spot of the falling rubble, the wise advice of his sensei guiding him, all gone because we need to wrap these fights up before the halfway mark to squeeze everything else in. For the isolated world of this movie, these character moments were largely unnecessary. After all, this is Vivi's emotional journey and Luffy's physical triumph, but in the larger world of One Piece media, it forms a depressing warning about the trajectory of supplementary content. Episode of Alabasta dictates its cuts under the assumption that you are familiar with the Alabasta arc, creating an insular environment where incoming and unfamiliar fans are shut out or left confused or dissatisfied. Instead of rewarding longtime fans with fancy visuals and a retelling of a beloved chunk of the story, all that's accomplished is putting a shiny veneer on a country club sign that says members only. I want to preface that what I'm going to say next does not reflect on fans of One Piece. In my experience since starting the show and making my videos, the One Piece fandom is largely accepting and welcoming of newcomers and eager to share their interest with new fans. There may be some negative swaths of fandom out there, and maybe I've just been lucky to not run into them, but I wholeheartedly think that the One Piece fandom in general treats casual fans and new fans very well compared to other fan groups I've been a part of. Toei Animation, on the other hand, would murder any individual fan if they could make 10 yen doing it, and would do it with a smile on their faces if that fan had only seen 10 episodes. Individual artists and employees at Toei probably think differently, but to the company as a whole, the only way to be a fan of One Piece, or any of their shows really, is to hand over lots and lots of money for merchandise and movie tickets and all that jazz. In making Episode of Alabasta as the 8th movie, Toei is setting up a future of One Piece media that rewards only the fans that they consider worth it, those who have paid in the most and viewed the most while casting aside the rest. And it's easy to understand why they went this route. Let's look back at all of the movies released during the Water 7 Saga's anime run. We have 3 of them, movies 6, 7, and 8. Each was a path that One Piece could have gone down. Movie 6 was bold, experimental, pushed the series in new directions, and earned 3 million less than the previous movie, so the new territory path was abandoned. Movie 7 followed the same formula and tropes as the previous, largely successful One Piece movies, to the point that some people consider it to be parodying those movies, and grossed an additional 3 million less at the box office. Say goodbye to the tried and true path, and that leaves movie 8, a retelling of the climactic arc, as faithful as it can be while staying within the restrictions that a 90-minute runtime imposes. And sure, this one didn't gain any box office traction, but it also didn't lose as much as the previous drops. I probably came off as a grumbling curmudgeon a bit so far in this video, so I want to elaborate that I think it is a completely fair and rewarding strategy to make movies with a focus on longtime fans. Just that I think the way Episode of Alabasta went about doing so was the wrong fashion. No other One Piece movie relied on knowing the series to the same extent while still managing to deliver fan-servicey moments. Chopper's Kingdom on the Island of Strange Animals, for instance, has a moment where Chopper reminisces on his time with Hero Look. It's kept brief and imparts Chopper's emotional connection to his flag to anyone who hasn't seen Drum Island, while anyone who has can point and shout at the screen because they understood that reference. Baron Matsuri's big twist is hinted at by one of the bad guys talking about his crew recently meeting Gold Roger. The impossibility of that statement is pointed out in the movie, but it's still a moment that fans can use to connect the story to the wider world of One Piece. In Dead End Adventure, when Luffy fights Gaspard, he straight up uses a couple of the moves that he used against Crocodile, a callback that doubles as a silly moment of action. Episode of Alabasta, on the other hand, relies on emotional connections rather than pattern recognition. Take for instance the scene where Luffy punches Vivi. It's supposed to be a moment where Luffy displays that they're all in this together and that Vivi isn't the only one risking her own life. She has to be prepared for pain and the possibility of someone dying. In the anime and manga, it comes not after just the preceding arcs of the saga, but also after we've spent a decent chunk of time in Alabasta and ventured all the way to Yuba, which is to say, even if you skip straight to the start of the Alabasta arc, you would still have the time to connect with Vivi and the Straw Hats. Episode of Alabasta skips over everything between Bon Clay leaving the Mary and Yuba, meaning that we spend roughly 5 minutes and 55 seconds of the 15 minutes and 8 seconds that it takes to get to this part of the film focused on the Straw Hats, and Bon Clay ends up with more screen time than any individual character, including Vivi. To be fair, that 5:55 isn't precise, and the Straw Hats do also spend a decent amount of time on screen with Bon Clay. I'm just considering it separate since the focus of the scene is on the Mary's special guest rather than its permanent residence. But it still doesn't bode well, and the rest of the time spent with the Straw Hats is broken up into chunks that last less than 2.5 minutes at their longest, and a decent amount of that time is spent in Yuba talking about the rebel army. That's all to say, the biggest problem with Episode of Alabasta, and its relative lack of failure compared to the preceding One Piece movies, is that it makes the series required viewing for the emotional beats to hit, a problem entirely caused by trying to fit such a large arc into just an hour and a half. To quote a contemporary review of the first English release, "Squeezing an enormous plot into a teeny little film like a man in a midlife crisis trying to squeeze into high school jeans, One Piece trims itself so that the flabby love handles don't show in its new feature-length duds. The result is more a reminder of times past than a work of art, but given the length of time we may have to wait before an unbutchered version of those times is available, it's better than nothing." And if you think I've gotten up in arms all for nothing throughout this whole video, then let me just point out that we don't live in 2007, and we can see the direct ramifications of Episode of Alabasta in the 9th One Piece movie. Heck, they're literally remastering Fishman Island as we speak. Maybe all that material is better than Episode of Alabasta. I'm still working my way through the show one episode at a time, so I can't comment on their quality quite yet. But what I can tell you is that by cutting so much growth and connection for so many characters, by sidelining the villains, and by simply putting too much on its plate, Episode of Alabasta sets the example on exactly how not to remake an old arc. Thanks for watching. I'd like to start off by thanking my lovely Patreon supporters who had early access to this video, as well as access to longer cuts of my individual episode reviews, and to watch-along videos for over 200 episodes now. Oh wow, I wrote that a while ago, it's over 3. As for everyone else, if you want to stick around for a little bit, you can check out all of my One Piece movie videos right here, or just watch everything I put out compiled in one place right here, broken up saga by saga. Or you can subscribe to stick around for when I release my next One Piece movie video, when I cover Episode of Chopper Plus, The Miracle Winter Cherry Blossom Bloom.